Off the record. Speech is something that defines humanity and likely has catapulted us to the lofty position that we currently enjoy. Well back into our history, this wasn't always the case, however, but due to evolutionary changes within our jaws, throats, and brains, eventually we obtained a way to communicate with one another that no other animal has been capable of doing, apart from just basically noise creation that must be interpreted, and even then it only conveys a very limited amount of information. Human speech, however, can convey ideas, higher concepts, morality, stories, and traditions. Arguably what makes us human is our ability to talk to one another, be understood, and for the person we are talking to be able to internalize that information and respond appropriately. There's a darker side to speech, as with all gifts in the human body. Lies, deception, and aggression are other ways in which we can use speech in order to either manipulate those around us or hurt them if that is our intention. But to understand speech and its importance, we have to go back to when we were much hairier and lower on the food chain. Millions of years ago, as we were barely standing up on two legs as Australopithecus, our feet were just barely becoming something that we would slightly recognize as our own now, but still very much so look like grasping limbs in some manner. As the trees our ancestors enjoyed receded and the savanna took over, we needed to look over the taller grass in order to see predators. We had alert calls to one another back then, likely, but speech was still way outside the mental grasp of our ancestors and even physical grasp as well. As time passed, the species would continue to grow, become more upright, and have the jawbone become smaller, all because the food in which they were eating became easier to chew and digest. Switching from fibrous plant material to eat, the muscle attachment points at the top of the skull, which allowed for the jaw to contract with great force, would be reduced in size as the food became easier to chew. This, coupled with the fact that meat being consumed provided more dense caloric intake, meant that the muscles of the face and skull could be smaller. As this diet continued for hundreds of thousands of years, tool usage would become more prevalent in our species until we finally unlocked a critical point: cooking. Cooking would allow more nutrients to be unlocked from our food, making our intestinal tract more efficient at processing nutrients, which put less strain on the systems and allowed for more nutrients to continue building the brain, which then allowed for more tool usage, which allowed for better cooking options and hunting strategies until we finally hit Homo erectus. Looking relatively close to what modern humans look like, this was a critical point in the human journey. The throats and vocal cord systems of the body were to change. The brain was larger and could accommodate complex thought, and hunting patterns and large social groups required communication on a much bigger scale. It is hypothesized that this is when the genus Homo started communicating through speech and with one another, which would go on to unlock quite literally the secrets of the universe with the splitting of the atom. With smaller attachment points in the skull allowing for the skull shape to change and become wider, larger brains were able to be housed in these skulls due to the nutrients being taken in from the changing diet and structural changes to the throat, making it possible for air to be changed and constricted to form noises that would eventually go on to be understood as words. This was what would go on to make us a species that we are today, one that heavily relies on what others say and convey to us. This is why lies can be so effective, or words said to you inspire emotional, biological responses simply because of the movement of air in other people's throats. And this is what makes SCP-1077 quite concerning. Any species that is capable of figuring out the complex system, because considering it took humans millions of years to do so, this would mean that they are either our equal or even beyond what we are, as there are context clues that it may understand the human brain better than we do. Item number: SCP-1077. Object Class: Euclid. Special Containment Procedures: a single specimen of SCP-1077 is kept in a secure 3 by 3 by 3.5 containment area at Biosite 95. The containment area is filled up with soil at 1 meter in depth and a variety of plant species native to SCP-1077's natural habitat, as well as dead plant material has been introduced to provide it with the material for decomposition. The containment area is to be contained as per standard protocols for Biosafety Level 4 containment areas. Staff working at Biosite 95 must be regularly tested for SCP-1077 infection. Infectees are to be quarantined, stripped of security clearance, and treated for systemic mycosis. Infectees must be assessed by a medical doctor briefed on SCP-1077 before they may be released. Instances of SCP-1077 found in the wild are to be destroyed immediately using fungicidal compound 82A, and the surrounding area must be monitored for 2 months in order to ascertain possible SCP-1077 resurgence. MTF-7, the glass jar, is charged with eradication of the wild population. Current target date for eradication of wild SCP-1077 population is set at // Should SCP-1077 infectees appear outside of the Foundation custody, they are to be immediately taken into custody and terminated. SCP-1077 infectees not affiliated with the Foundation that are currently in the Foundation custody are to be treated for systemic mycosis and released following administration of an appropriate amnestic. SCP-1077 infectees are to be considered Level 4 biohazards and must be treated or transported in accordance to biohazard protocol. Testimony of SCP-1077 infectees is to be considered suspect. The bodies of all casualties exposed to 1077 must be incinerated immediately. SCP-1077 would appear to be a form of fungus that is naturally found on this planet. Because of that, it can be postulated that it may have roots in the coevolution of humanity. Anything that can understand a species to the point of that complexity that is humanity would need to be treated as having innate knowledge, or at least an increased understanding of that species. Description: SCP-1077 is a species of fungus bearing a distinct resemblance to some members of the genus Agaricaceae, of the family Agaricaceae. It is native to the temperate woodland of and has a relatively limited range within this area. The fungus grows in soil and produces a fruiting body with a fleshy, gilled cap and stalk, white in coloration. Unlike most members of this genus, SCP-1077 produces extremely small translucent spores, which are largely invisible to the human eye. SCP-1077 does not present overtly anomalous properties unless its spores are inhaled. While the anomalous effects are present in animals, they are most notable in humans. Despite the fact that it is found in the wild, however, it is most interesting of how it affects the meat suits and at what rate. Clearly though, even when entering the body, the immune system does attempt to remove the invader based on the logs and the studies that have been conducted, but most are not successful, and should an individual be immune compromised, this would ultimately make them more of an easier target for SCP-1077. However, with that said, we will discuss how the body goes on to clear infections from fungal invaders momentarily, but first, we must understand how SCP-1077 enters the body and what it does. Description continued. When its spores are inhaled in sufficient quantities, SCP-1077 has a roughly 70% chance of inducing systemic mycosis of the respiratory tract, although this is greater amongst those with compromised immune systems. The spores settle in the throat, windpipe, and lungs and begin to grow. SCP-1077 infection has no apparent symptoms for several days after infection. After this, it begins to cause minor irritation to the throat and chest area, as well as causing bouts of coughing in the infectees. However, symptoms rarely progress beyond this state, and many infectees mistake the symptoms for common minor illness. Now, every single day, you are inundated with spores from molds and funguses. Truly, there is a fungus among us. Living on this planet and inhaling the air around us, all manner of organisms are brought into the respiratory tract. In fact, this is so common. We have many different evolutionary adaptations to counter this. Tiny hair-like cells within the lung will beat, sweeping debris away from the lung surface, allowing it to be moved further up the tract and coughed up. But notably, the most aggressive adaptation is the recruitment of macrophages to the area. When a mold spore enters the lung and may be too large for the hair cells to get rid of, macrophages will arrive in the lung itself and go to the surface where they will patrol. Once finding a spore, they will engulf it and destroy it. This ensures that the mold spore doesn't even have a chance to begin growing in quite possibly the best area it's ever found. Your lung tissue, which has a ton of moisture, is dark and also warm. Basically, it's like a mold paradise down there. However, it is not a perfect process. SCP-1077 is able to overcome these hairs, macrophages, and likely inflammation in the area to evade capture. But judging by what it's able to do to the throat itself, likely it may be releasing some sort of immunosuppressant within the lung tissue itself to avoid detection by the macrophages. However, this isn't perfect. Due to its 70% infection rate, or at least successful infection rate, this means that some macrophages, despite SCP-1077's attempt to remain undetected, still has them being found out and destroyed by the host's immune system. And this is why immunocompromised people are at greater risk, as their immune systems are not as successful at finding and destroying SCP-1077. Even still though, once 1077 has established itself, it will begin to grow much like any other life form, and the human body is the perfect environment for mold growth. It would appear though, as 1077 does spread, its intelligence increases, meaning that the fungal colony may work as some sort of neurological network, meaning that as it grows, it becomes more intelligent, and this does, however, take time. Description continued. Approximately 12 to 18 days after initial infection, the primary anomalous effects of SCP-1077 infection become apparent. Through a currently unknown mechanism, the fungus will alter the vocal patterns of the infected. This causes humans infected by the fungus to, when speaking, make comments other than those the speaker had intended. This begins as slight mistakes or replacements of single words, but rapidly develops into a state where the fungus appears to be able to manipulate the host's voice completely. The condition appears to have some effect on the perception as well. Subjects often fail to notice the changes in their speech unless it is brought to their attention, and in some cases will fail to notice that they have spoken at all. Changes in vocal patterns are diverse, initially completely incomprehensible to outside observers, but rapidly becoming more coherent as the condition progresses. Through the host, SCP-1077 may manipulate others through changes in the host, or in certain cases speak directly to observers. In most cases, changes in speech manifest as the infectee making remarks seemingly intended to lead to its own death. Infectees may launch into impassioned insults and personal attacks in order to provoke others into attacking itself. They may threaten violence against others and may mislead others into directly or indirectly bringing about their death. SCP-1077 can utilize any pertinent information available to the host in order to further this effect. Based on the log here, we can surmise a few things from the infection as it progresses. The first is, while it's mentioned that only the vocal cords are invaded, resulting in the alteration of the vocal patterns, something must be more intertwined, and that's what's happening with these infected. At first, it's likely that the fungus is being on the vocal cords themselves, and they could change the shape of the vocal cords themselves to suit what they'd like. But this appears to just be sort of random, and that's why only individual words are changed at first. It's not until later that the effects become much more noticeable, which by then this suggests that more neural activity is being affected by 1077. It's not so much just the vocal cords under attack, but the entire body. This was mentioned earlier when the systemic mycosis was a cited issue. Systemic mycosis is when your organs of your body itself become infected by a fungal infection, meaning that it has worked its way into those organs and continued to grow. Because of this, we know 1077 has the ability to spread within the body, leading to disastrous results for those if it should happen. Yet 1077 is hypothesized to just stay within the vocal cords. I highly doubt this. I would propose that 1077 is actually affecting first the nerves immediately around the vocal cords. The host thinks about saying something, and occasionally 1077 is able to intercept those signals and route it somewhere else in the vocal cord, changing the contraction of that tissue via electrical signal, which in turn causes the word to change. Now, that doesn't sound too harmful, but as mentioned previously, this can cause the host themselves to begin seeking out less than suitable outcomes for themselves by saying things to others that they have no control over. But where we see evidence of what SCP-1077 is doing to the person, we have to look at the actual intellect of the fungal growth and what it displays, which should be more alarming to those who are tasked with keeping it contained. Description continued. Certain instances of SCP-1077 display other, more varied vocal alterations, not necessarily engineered to result in the host body's death, either manipulating people around the host through alterations in the language or in order to directly address others. The entity responsible for these alterations appears to be intelligent and capable of extensive forward planning and deception in order to achieve its goal, which appears to be the propagation of SCP-1077. Each infection of 1077 appears to have a unique identity and refers to the other SCP-1077 species in general as their people, and other distinct 1077 instances as their siblings. Instances of 1077 appear to vary wildly in personality and individual intelligence. Instances of 1077 appear to be able to communicate with each other in some manner and transfer information. SCP-1077 infection does not necessarily lead to immediate development of anomalous effects, and as a result of the infection may not be outwardly identifiable as such for extended periods of time, since the entity will sometimes go to extreme lengths to conceal itself. After an unknown amount of time, SCP-1077 can begin to affect other forms of communication by the subject, including sign language, writing, or typing. It should be noted that 1077 cannot affect the host in any other way than altering methods of communication. Other activities undertaken by the host are unaffected. Specifically pertaining to how the fungus is able to interact with other areas of communication such as sign language, writing, and typing is where we truly see the extent of this infection. We know that the fungus itself is intelligent to the point that, discussed later, it will conceal itself. But this may imply that its cellular morphology means it's able to communicate within itself, but also understand what the host is doing. The vocal cords manipulation is no longer the product of happenstance, but it has spread to the organ which is highly important to the host's functionality, the brain. With the fungus having infected the brain case of a person and subsequently the 3-pound anxiety machine within it, it is able to ensure that the infection progresses towards to the route that it wants to. By invading the area of the brain known as the Broca's area, it no longer has to rely on movement of vocal cords to change words. Instead, it is likely completely inundating the area with its own fungal cells, pulling and pushing on neurons in the area to fire. And this could explain why the host feels like they are the ones saying it and do not feel like the words have changed, because it is in fact their brain sending the signal, but instead of the signal being really produced by them, it's simply being co-opted by the fungus itself, and this would clearly give the host the feeling that they are the one that said it. This intertwining with the brain is clearly seen in the more physical movements as well. Sign language shows that areas like the Broca's area are afflicted with this type of fungus. Those with damage to Broca's area have difficulty producing signs for sign language, and those with damage to the Wernicke's area have difficulty interpreting sign language. Because of this, it wouldn't be enough for the vocal cords to be altered, and the neurological areas would have to be afflicted in some capacity. And this may actually be how SCP-1077 is communicating with each other, because they're simply ingrained in the Broca and Wernicke's area. Wernicke being responsible for understanding speech, which is then translated so that it can have others communicate to it, and the Broca's area literally being able to speak to other entities of 1077. So as long as the Broca's area is targeted by the fungus, then this method of communication really does not matter. This communication from host to host is altered irrevocably. The ability to interact with neurons also gives us clues as to how this fungus operates. While being a fungus itself, it grows in colonies, but instead of each cell just being a fungal cell, it appears something happened to the cellular morphology which resulted in an adaptation at some point, giving the cells the ability to interact with each other, much like what we see with neural cells. With each cell communicating with the other cell next to it, and even possibly further than that, it may operate a lot like how our brains do with specialized areas, ability to reason, and planning. Planning being the most concerning aspect. Addendum 1077-1. When SCP-1077 was initially contained, its capability for altering written documents and its apparent sapience were not discovered, but on top of this, its virulence was severely underestimated. Flawed containment procedures written at the time resulted in a prolonged containment breach lasting for at least 21 days, during which a significant amount of Biosite-95 staff were infected by SCP-1077, with the breach only being discovered upon an external examination, prompted by record numbers of work-related deaths and incidences by professional misconduct at the site. Following Incident 1077-A, containment procedures were reevaluated and extensive testing conducted to determine SCP-1077's true properties. All infected staff were treated for systemic mycosis and have since made a full return to active duty. Upgrade to Keter class is requested but ultimately denied following implementation of current procedures. This intellect, again, requires the communication of many cells interconnected with thousands, if not tens of thousands of connections within our own brains to function properly. This is prevalent in those who have advanced forms of the infection, as seen in the interview conducted between Mrs. Amanda Church and researcher Addendum 1077-2. Interviewed Mrs. Amanda Church, a civilian affected by SCP-1077 infection. Researcher forward on // Mrs. Church called a local radio show and demonstrated highly sensitive knowledge related to the Foundation. Mrs. Church was apprehended by the Foundation agents shortly thereafter and infection was verified. Standard disinformation tactics were employed to dismiss her claims as those of an eccentric conspiracy theorist. This occurrence has been classified as Incident 1077-B. The interview was conducted via an electronic speaker system so that researcher could not be exposed to 1077. Mrs. Church is restrained. It is not fully known to what extent 1077 has altered her voice during this conversation, or what Mrs. Church intended to say during sections in which her voice was altered. Begin log. Hello, Mrs. Church. Why have you brought me to Biosite 95? That is not your current location. You have been brought here in order to assess the danger posed by a fungal entity that has infected you. What do you mean? You are infected by an unusual strain of fungus capable of altering your voice. Please do not panic. You'll be allowed to leave should you cooperate. From now on, I will address the entity infecting this body. This is understood. Researcher, from now on, you may assume that all remarks made by Mrs. Church are on behalf of the one of the people that you classify as SCP-1077. How did you gain access to information which you had Mrs. Church transmit How do you know my name? Everything is shared among us, in a way. A sibling of mine was aware of the information and passed it on to me. You seem unusually willing to explain this to me. Why? No obfuscation is necessary, as I am here to deliver a message. The information I coerced Mrs. Church into transmitting was both a ploy to attract attention and also a demonstration of power. What is your message? Release my sibling at once, or else the next body we find will reveal far more damaging information about your organization. You want us to remove containment on the specimen of SCP-1077 currently in containment? In essence, yes. Cease this persecution of the people and of our sibling, or we will use this information our siblings had previously acquired from your operatives. That is all. We will consider it. We live to spread. Let us spread, or suffer the consequences. In log. Closing statement. Mrs. Church was treated as per standard procedure and her body incinerated following this interview. That sucks. Since Incident 1077-B, instances of 1077 infection have occurred, of which led to an attempt breach of secrecy. No information has been released which has not been consistent with the information known to the personnel involved in Incident 1077-A. So far, standard disinformation tactics have proven effective at combating breaches of secrecy caused by 1077. Relative remoteness of the fungi's inhabited range and low rate of human contact have largely prevented 1077 from becoming a major threat to the Foundation's security. Further interviews with other SCP-1077 instances have indicated that 1077 does not present a united front in opposition to the Foundation. Many instances of 1077 are not interested in further hostile action, considering such actions to be unnecessary and antagonistic. Due to SCP-1077's largely hostile intent, currently uncontained nature, and persistent ability to cause information leaks, the stated mission of Mobile Task Force Upsilon 7 has been modified to include attempted eradication of 1077 from its environment. Ultimately, SCP-1077 is a highly intelligent entity. While not being labeled Keter class, the ability of it to infect and infiltrate human society with the host largely not knowing that they are even infected and being changed means that any number of people can be infected right now, infecting others down the line. Not to mention, with it naturally occurring on the planet, even if it is in a somewhat isolated area and colonies still being destroyed, this means it's nowhere near containment. Having its own goals and desires to spread using humans as a base means that it may be a new adaptation for this fungus only recently acquired, as any other forms surely would have resulted in this outcome earlier on. This leads me to believe that this adaptation would be specifically how to avoid potentially the immune system's functions in order to appropriately infect a host, but also the possibility that it may have just recently come into its own and is now able to better connect and communicate with itself. But this also may mean that the intellect now is newly acquired and it just needs a puppet in order to speak.